I'm Heather Furco, Youth Services Library Administrator for LA County Library, and I have the great privilege of introducing you to our speakers. Leading our conversation tonight is our Library Director, Skye Patrick. Skye Patrick was appointed LA County Library Director in 2016. In her role, she is responsible for the LA County Library's 86 library locations, 15 vehicle mobile fleet, and resources that are used by more than 3.4 million customers across LA County. Skye is committed to breaking down barriers and increasing access for all. In addition to helping LA County Library go fine-free and initiating several other services to help provide more access and opportunity for customers, Skye launched the library's iCount Equity Initiative, which ensures library services and programs address the needs of LA County Library's diverse communities. Under Skye's leadership, LA County Library received the 2023 National Medal of Museum and Library Service, the nation's highest honor given to museums and libraries. Skye continues to reinforce the library's role in the community as a civic and cultural center, a hub for public information services and discourse, and an institution of literacy, innovation, and learning. Tonight, Skye will be interviewing Emily Hanford, American education reporter and host and producer of the hit podcast, Sold a Story, How Teaching Kids to Read Went So Wrong. Sold a Story was the second most shared show on Apple Podcasts in 2023 and one of Time Magazine's top 3 podcasts of the year. Sold a Story has garnered some of the highest honors in journalism, including a DuPont Columbia Award, an Edward R. Murrow Award, an IRE Award, 2 Scripps Howard Awards, a Third Coast Impact Award, and a Peabody nomination. Emily has been covering education for American public media since 2008. She is the recipient of numerous awards for her work, including the EWA Public Service Award in 2019 for Hard Words, and an award from American Educational Research Association for excellence in reporting on education research. Welcome, Emily. Skye, now we'll hand the program over to you.
Thank you, Heather. That was a great introduction. Oh, sorry, I should turn on both lights. I appreciate all the acknowledgement. I do want to just say thank you to the team here at LA County. All of those awards, I don't get them alone. I work with a group. There is no I in team. So I just want to center. Hello to you, Emily. I'm going to get to you in just a second as soon as I do our land acknowledgement for the county. The County of Los Angeles recognizes that we occupy land originally and still inhabited and cared for by the Tongva, Taquiam, Serrano, Heath, and Chumash peoples. We honor and pay respects to their elders and descendants, past, present, and emerging, as they continue their stewardship of these lands and waters. We acknowledge that settler colonization resulted in land seizure, disease, subjugation, slavery, relocation, broken promises, genocide, and multi-generational trauma. This acknowledgement demonstrates our responsibility and commitment to truth, healing, reconciliation, and elevating the stories, culture, and community of the original inhabitants of Los Angeles County. We are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on these ancestral lands. We are dedicated to growing and sustaining relationships with Native peoples and local tribal governments, including, in no particular order, the Fernandino Taquiam Band of Mission Indians, the Gabrielino Tongva Indians of California Tribal Council, the Gabrielino Tongva San Gabriel Band of Mission Indians, Gabrielino Band of Mission Indians Quiche Nation, San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, and San Fernando Band of Mission Indians. Emily, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
We are really thrilled to have this conversation with you. I just want to note for our participants that today, nationally, AT&T had issues with bandwidth and internet services all day. So I certainly hope this doesn't affect us tonight, but if it does, we'll try and take some precautions. Maybe we'll turn our cameras off if it starts to lag a little bit. If worse comes to worse, we'll have to possibly reschedule, but let's hope none of that happens. I just wanted to forefront that before we get started. Emily, do you want to talk a little bit about Sold a Story? There are quite a few people on, and I've had the pleasure of listening to a couple of the podcasts, but can you kind of orient this conversation? What is Sold a Story? How did it get started? And how did you end up doing this work?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. Thanks everyone for being here tonight. It's late for me. I'm on the East Coast, so it's about 9 o'clock my time. But I'm glad to be with you all. So Sold a Story is a podcast that first came out in October of 2022. It's 6 episodes originally, and there are 2 more episodes that came out last spring, and we're working on a couple more episodes now, including a translation into Spanish, which is coming out within the next couple of weeks. So Sold a Story is about how teaching kids to read went so wrong. That's the subtitle. And it is the result of years of reporting that I have done on this issue, this question of how people learn to read and how many children are or were being taught to read in school. So I would say that Sold a Story was the result of a whole bunch of questions I had about how it happened that reading instruction in many schools is really not very well aligned with this gigantic body of research that some people are referring to as the science of reading, which isn't a curriculum or a thing you do, but it's basically a body of research that's been done by cognitive scientists and many other researchers in classrooms and in labs around the world over the past 50 years or so. So a lot of this research really got going in the 1970s and 80s. And scientists figured out a lot of things about how we read. How do we even do that? How does that work? How do our brains do it? How do we learn to read? What does everyone need to learn to become a good reader? What is the difference between learning to read and learning to talk? Because it turns out those are very different processes, cognitive processes in the brain. And so I did several pieces of reporting starting in about 2017, 2018, 2019 that were really just sort of explanatory journalism. They were just sort of explaining what has been discovered about reading and how it works and how is it being taught in many schools. And Sold a Story was our attempt to answer some questions that were just piling up for years as we were doing this reporting, which is the how and the why. How did it happen that instruction was so far apart from what a lot of the scientific evidence sort of points us towards? And I think even more shocking, not only are a lot of kids not being taught to read in ways that really line up with what the scientific research shows us, but that there are some things that teachers have learned to do in the name of good practice that turn out to be really at odds with what the scientific research says. So I think that some of the things that teachers are doing in school, thinking they're doing what they should be doing, is actually making it harder for some kids to learn how to read. And so that's what we explore in Sold a Story.
Thank you. That's fascinating. I'm already taking notes. I have a feeling I'm going to have a whole page and a half of notes once I'm finished interviewing you. So maybe you can talk a little bit about what your interest, obviously you're a journalist, but why literacy? What were you seeing? What oriented you towards this subject? Do you have kids or are you an auntie? Like, what were you seeing to get you interested in this topic?
Yeah. Well, it's a good question. I have sort of 2 answers. So professionally speaking, I've been an education reporter for quite a long time, so since 2008, and I was doing a lot of reporting on a lot of different things related to education, mostly like sort of long form pieces. I wasn't doing daily news. I did that earlier in my career, but by the time I became an education reporter, I was really digging deep and making these audio, radio documentary programs, like digging in on 2 or 3 topics a year. And was really interested in a couple of things. I was really interested in how people learn and what has been learned from cognitive science about that. And I'm also really interested in larger questions about education and schooling And I think we have this hope, this belief, and there is this reality that in America, and in many places, but education is really such a key part of social mobility, right? And giving people a chance to go further, do more, have more upward mobility than their parents. And I think I was just sort of always interested in the questions about the extent to which sort of public schools in America are doing that or not. So that was sort of like the general gist of things that I was doing as an education reporter starting in about 2008. And then you asked this question, am I a mom? Am I an auntie? I really have gotten sort of obsessed with this topic of how people learn to read over the past 6 years. And I think a lot of people assume, well, you must have some personal story, because a lot of people do. It turns out there are a number of people who get really involved in this issue. And it's often because there's some personal story. They have a child, a grandchild, they themselves had a really hard time learning how to read, really struggle to get the help they need in school. I don't have that kind of personal story. So I don't remember very much about learning to read. I was in first grade in the 1970s. I think learning to read was pretty easy for me. I have two boys. They're now 23 and 20. And learning to read was pretty easy for them too. So I didn't think very much about how people learn to read. And I sort of assumed when I sent my kids off to school that they would learn how to read and they would be taught to read. And they did learn to read. And I didn't think about it very much. And what I started to learn when I started to begin to realize that there was this disconnect, that there was all this research about reading, and there was this disconnect between what was happening in schools and what we really know about how people learn to read. One of the big takeaways from that research is some people learn to read very easily. Some people it's very, very difficult for. And most people are somewhere in between. And it doesn't have to do with intelligence. There are very, very smart people, very smart little kids, very smart adults who struggle with reading. And one of the really key things, one of the things we know from a lot of research is that instruction matters. That reading is something that you need to be taught how to do. Again, some of us don't need very much instruction, but some of us need a lot. But it is not something you learn to do naturally, like you learn how to speak, right? So if a baby is going to start to learn to speak her native language as long as people are speaking to her and she doesn't have a major hearing problem or cognitive deficit, she will learn to speak her native language. I think that main basic assumption undergirded a lot of reading instruction for a long time too. That you will learn to read if you are surrounded by books, if you are motivated to read, if you're read to a lot, if you're interested in doing it. If you want to learn how to read, you will sort of learn to read by reading. And it turns out that that isn't true at the very sort of early stages, that learning written language is very different than learning spoken language. We're actually born with brains that are wired to read because as human beings, we have been walking around on this earth for a very, very, very long time and talking to each other. We just invented written language kind of recently, like 5,000 years ago. We actually don't have brains that are sort of evolved to do it. They're not sort of meant to read. Our brains can get very good at reading, very, very good at reading, but it's not something that happens naturally. So instruction is really a key part of it. But there's this continuum about how much instruction you need. And I think the other thing that really engaged me very early on with this topic was recognizing that there were lots and lots of kids out there who were struggling because they were not getting the kind of or the intensity of instruction they needed in school because the assumption just generally undergirding it all was kind of a little bit of instruction and a lot of being exposed to books was going to be enough for most kids. And it turns out that's not enough for most kids. But here's what's happening in this country. And I learned this from doing lots and lots of interviews with lots and lots of people and hearing the same story over and over again, which is kid goes to school, parent knows something isn't quite right. They go to the teacher says, everything's going to be fine. Just read lots of books to him. It's going to be fine. It's not fine. It's not fine. It's not fine. The parents are going, something's really wrong here. The school's saying, no, it's going to be fine. And then the parents really start to realize by second grade or third grade that they have a real problem on their hands. And here's what happens if the parents have time and money, especially money, is the parents deal with it themselves. Either they go to their local library, perhaps, and we can come back to this, and try to find some kind of resources that they can use to teach their child to read, which a lot of libraries don't necessarily have. We can come back to that. They end up very often hiring tutors, which can cost 50, 60 more dollars an hour. It can get very, very expensive. So what I started to realize is lots of kids are going to school. They're not getting the instruction they need. Lots of kids from lots of different backgrounds are struggling. There are some reasons why kids from certain kinds of backgrounds might struggle more overall, right? But lots of kids are going, needing more help than they're getting in school, needing more instruction than they're getting in school. And some kids have parents who are their backup plan, especially their parents' checkbooks. And their parents are getting them, they're not dependent on school for the instruction because they can get what they need in other ways. Not that it's easy. You know, there's lots and lots of families and parents who struggle mightily financially and emotionally with all of this. But at the end of the day, they can kind of get their kids the instruction they need. But lots and lots of parents can't do that. Lots and lots of kids rely on schools to teach them to read. And if they don't get it in school, many of these kids do not become good readers. And it derails them at the very beginning of their education.
That's right.
Because kids go to school and one of the things that they're expected to do, and they know they're expected to do in kindergarten, first, second grade, is learn how to read. And many kids start to realize that this is very hard for them. And it starts to turn them off to school, and they quickly start to fall behind in lots of other subjects. And if you're not a pretty good reader by the end of second, beginning of third grade, you're starting to miss out on all kinds of other stuff that's going on in school. And your trajectory in school is just so different from that kid who got a good start for whatever combination of reasons. Some good instruction in school, some help from parents, the fact that it's just not that hard for them for whatever reason. They get off to a good start. And this is a very exponential process, right? There's a term for this called, it's the Matthew effect. It's a biblical reference. The rich get richer. And it happens really fast. You get off to a good start with reading, and it's just this like virtuous cycle that you really flourish and have access to all kinds of things in the curriculum and all kinds of things in your world that you can get to through reading. And when kids struggle, they sort of limp along and they get a little bit better, and they do eventually usually get a little bit better, but just not enough better until it becomes very frustrating and very difficult. It turns into behavior problems for some kids, other kids.
I was just thinking that, yeah.
All those things.
You know, you're bringing up so many different topics, and I hope I have an opportunity to kind of tease this out a little. I was going to ask you, so, I think you said it. You don't learn to read by reading, or you don't learn to read by reading more. So that's a huge misconception. I think many of us who are in literacy to some extent, we think that. We preach that. In fact, we evangelize that. What are some other misconceptions around kids learning to read that you've discovered in your research? I mean, it's obvious that, you know, people who are wealthy or people who have more resources to use. And so that one is pretty obvious. And we'll talk about inequity in just a little bit.
Well, let me say the first one about the sort of learn to read by reading. So this is a very important and kind of subtle point, because actually, if you dig into this scientific research on reading, and we have a reading list on the Soul to Story webpage, by the way, which with some just key sort of books and articles, if you're interested in digging in more, because this stuff is just intellectually really fascinating, interesting stuff. But if you dig into that research, what you'll find is that the key really is sort of getting off to a good start, sort of making some key recognitions and understanding the way that this system works, the relationships between sounds and letters, between print and spoken language, and that kids usually require some degree of instruction in that in the beginning. But once you start to understand how this works, a lot of what you learn, a lot of how we learn to read is we do learn to read by reading. So it's like once we know the initial thing about how to sort of break the code of written language and understand how that works, then we really do learn to read by reading. And this is where that Matthew effect comes in, right? So a kid who learns how to read is then teaching herself or himself so much of what they know by reading. So it turns out if you get off to a good start with reading, so much of the vocabulary that you know, the things you understand about language and how it works and grammar and language structure, so much of that is being learned through reading. There is definitely a role for instruction in school, a very important role for instruction in school. but you really do want to get kids reading and then get them reading a lot. And also, of course, we have a lot of challenges in our culture when it comes to that, right? So it is not a small factor that we have all of these competing things for our attention. And I think many of us know as adults that our own habits of reading have changed, our own attention focus. I used to read a lot more novels than I do now. And
I did too. I don't at all.
you
Hardly
know,
ever.
yeah, what a sad thing to say for someone who works in a library system, right?
I read a ton, but it's not a novel. It's usually
Yeah,
nonfiction. It's usually
me too.
factoids.
Yeah, me too. I think this is one of the things that schools are really dealing with right now. This is really difficult stuff. I think a lot of individual teachers and entire schools and school systems are having very big aha moments around all of this and recognizing, there's a lot of stuff here we didn't know. We need to change our instruction. We really need to do some things differently than we've done before.
Mm.
And I think a lot of schools right now are really trying to figure out how to do that. Translating all of these findings from research into practice is really difficult, and figuring out this very important line between the amount of explicit instruction that kids need, the really critical role of that early on in education, and then how to really have that implicit learning and statistical learning is how a lot of researchers talk about it, really take off. I think one of the things that's really important to recognize here, and that's part of what's going on, is that for whatever reason, I think much of the sort of image that people have in their mind of what they want school to be like for small children, the earliest children when they go to school, is sort of the opposite of what they think, and maybe even what explicit instruction really looks like, right? So many of us have this idea in our mind that we want school to be a lot about kids exploring things, figuring out things on their own, having lots of time to play. And I think you can think all of that. Those are certainly things that I thought about.
Kind of like the constructivist mind frame. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's really important to realize that some of this reading stuff comes up against some really strong beliefs about a constructivist kind of frame.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there are a few things to pull apart. The sort of constructivist idea about learning and how it works. And so this idea of sort of discovering things on your own, there's a place for that in all of us for learning. But when it comes to these foundational basic skills, like learning how to read, that's not the most efficient, effective way to make sure that the most number of kids have a chance to become a good reader.
Oh, it's interesting that you say that, because from a personal experience, I also had that sort of uneasiness in my stomach when my daughter was a little bit younger, and we were at a school who believed in constructivist theory, and just she'll learn through play and through conceptually building. And I do agree with you, there is a place for that. But what was always uneasy for me at that time was just how much instruction was happening. And so you're absolutely right. I took it on myself at home and taught her to read very young, using a lot of the concepts that I think we're going to talk about a little bit. Let me ask you a couple of questions about literacy education and impact of vulnerable communities. You kind of talked a little bit, you brought this up a little bit, and some of the barriers that these communities face. We work with, as a public library, a lot of lower income individuals or families, people of color, or homes where English is not the first language. What are your thoughts around, or maybe you can talk a little bit about the impact of this way that we don't instruct enough for those more vulnerable communities?
Yeah, obviously there's a lot of different things there. So one of the things that I've been really focusing on my reporting is just helping people understand, how do people learn to read? So maybe I can just take 1 second to explain a very simple concept here that I think can help everyone, because I think this is going to disentangle some of the things you're asking about kids who might come from more disadvantaged homes, or that might not be the right word to use, but kids who have a lot of challenges coming into school may not have as much access to academic knowledge and lots of vocabulary, or kids who don't speak English as a first language or are coming to school and are learning to speak English.
Or tacit learning, the ability to learn some of these things from home. Yeah.
Yes. So I think it's really important to recognize that, so there's this very simple equation that reading scientists put out a long time ago, back in the 1980s. And it's basically called the simple view of reading. And it doesn't say that reading is simple. It's this very simple way. It's a simple way to understand the very complex process of learning to read. And it's an equation that basically says your language comprehension, so nothing to do with reading, but just what do you, if someone is speaking to you or reading out loud to you, can you understand what they're saying? That's sort of like so if you could measure someone's language comprehension ability, that's sort of all the stuff they understand about language and the vocabulary they know. So your language comprehension times your ability to read the words, decode the words, know what the written words say. You can actually read the letters and know, like if it says R-E-A-D-I-N-G, you know that word is reading. Language comprehension times your decoding ability equals your reading comprehension. So it's a multiplication, it's not addition. So that means if you have no language comprehension ability, but you're really, really good at decoding words, your reading comprehension is going to be 0. And that's, for example, I can decode Spanish decently well because it's an easy language to decode, but I can't understand what I'm reading. So you can see the simple view of reading right there. Like my reading comprehension in Spanish is basically 0. I can decode it decently well. I don't know any of the words. My reading comprehension is 0. Same holds true if you're a little kid who comes into school. You're really precocious. You know lots and lots of stuff. You know thousands and thousands and thousands of words, but you don't know how to read them, and you struggle with learning how to read them. You've got great language comprehension ability. You've got close to 0 on the decoding side. Your reading comprehension is going to be really bad. So one of the things that's important to understand, so those are 2 really important parts. Can you decode the words, and do you know what the words mean? And then think about what can affect a child's ability on both sides of that equation. So your ability to understand the words can be very much affected by you don't speak English at home, so you don't have a very large English vocabulary, or you haven't had a lot of exposure to a lot of advanced vocabulary. So you really need school to make sure that they are paying attention to that side of the equation. They are really developing your understanding of language, your knowledge of stuff in the world. But the other part is your decoding ability. So schools really have to focus on that. And so it's those 2 parts. And the thing that I think is really important for teachers to understand is that most kids are coming into school with some language comprehension ability. Again, It varies a lot, but many of them have very little in the way of decoding ability, except for your example, your daughter, who you taught to read before she went to school. And many parents do this. And shockingly, many parents who go through with an older child, they go through hell trying to figure out what is going on with their kid and how to get their kid help. And then they've said to me, and what I learned from that is I am going to teach all my other children how to read before they go to school, which is a tall order, not necessarily an easy thing to do, and can be a very hard thing to do if the kid really struggles with reading, right? So some kids can learn this relatively easily. A parent can really do it with a book. Some kids are really going to need specialized instruction. They're going to rely on special ed services that they get in school or tutoring.
IEPs for public school.
Exactly.
If you could also kind of orient this idea, can you share with our listeners what is whole language versus phonics, which I think is a central theme of your podcast? Can you talk about that? Because I'm not sure how many listeners actually listened. I found it fascinating and of course forwarded it to several people. So I think we were able to help you get to that second most forwarded podcast. Can you talk about the difference and just help hopefully our parents or educators understand the difference between the 2?
Sure. One of the reasons we made this 6-part podcast is because there's a lot of history to all of this. And we try to go into it's kind of complex stuff. But I'll tell you that phonics instruction is something that people have been fighting about for hundreds of years, right? So you can go back to the beginning of public education in this country and see that people were fighting about phonics. And the basic fight was, when a kid is starting to learn how to read, should you start with the letters and sounds? Should you start with the little pieces and build up? Or should you start with the goal, which is the meaning? Should you start with the whole words, whole sentences, whole paragraphs, whole stories? So one idea is you have to sort of build these skills from the ground up. And the other is motivate kids, make them want to learn to read. And by sort of exposing them and having them read, they will learn to read. So that was sort of phonics. It wasn't really called whole language back then, but there was a real debate, I think a real legitimate debate around phonics, and a fear that focusing too much on the little pieces was going to be like boring and tedious and turn kids off to reading, right? So we fought about that for a really long time. And then there was this thing called whole, so that became what was known as sort of phonics versus whole word. Do you start with the whole words or you start with phonics? That was kind of a way that the debate was shaped in the early part of the 20th century. And then along came this thing called whole language, which was sort of borrowed some of the ideas and theories about reading and how it works from the whole word method, but wasn't really whole word. Whole word was like the Dick and Jane books, basically. Whereas like phonics is like hop on pop and the man's is standing on the can kind of thing, right? So then whole language comes along in the 60s and 70s. It sort of borrows the theory of reading and how it works from whole word, which is start with the meaning, emphasize the meaning. That's what's going to be interesting to kids. It came along with a more constructivist, sort of progressive idea about like have kids teach themselves, they can learn it themselves. So these things all got kind of intertwined and it did become a little political. So phonics was seen as sort of old-fashioned and conservative and traditional and Republican, and whole language was more liberal and all of that. And it truly became Democrat versus Republican at certain points in history, including in the early 2000s, and we talk about that some in the podcast. I think that one of the most important things for people to understand, two things. One, this isn't like we're not like going back to phonics. Like this is not all about phonics. And it's not like we used to know how to teach kids to read really well and all kinds of kids were reading and then we came along and like whole language messed everything up. There's not some like good old days when we were like doing a good
Thank
job
you for
with all
saying
kids.
that.
I think that's very important and to recognize. The data does not show us that. So what I think happened is all of this science of reading research that exploded in the 70s and 80s really showed us why phonics instruction is so important. Why is it so important to start with the letters and sounds? Why is it critical? Why you can't get good at reading the words unless you really understand that relationship between letters and sounds. So that's one of the things that the scientific research on reading showed us. And I think most people there were bang up crazy fights about phonics. But by the late 90s and early 2000s, there were big consensus reports that were really showing that phonics instruction is important. And I think there was sort of a basic acceptance, some of it a little bit begrudgingly, but sort of an acquiescence to well, kids need a little bit of phonics. And everyone kind of knows, of course you need to know your ABCs and your letters and sounds, right? So there was a kind of okay, so we'll do it. More and more you would see schools doing a little bit of phonics. But I think two things. One, were they doing enough of it? Did the teachers understand why? This is what's really important. I think a lot of teachers are just doing it because they thought they had to do it and they were supposed to do it, but they didn't really know why. And they themselves didn't understand a lot about how written English works. I don't think a lot of people do. I don't. I know a lot of it implicitly, but I don't know it well enough to explain it to a child. So there's a lot, and English is hard. This is the other thing. English is a very difficult language to learn. It turns out that to learn to read English takes just a typically developing reader 2 or 3 years to learn the basics of decoding that English language. Whereas Spanish, which is much more transparent, that it's not full of all kinds of silent letters, it's basically, there's a direct relationship between letters and sounds. So it's much easier to teach kids how to decode Spanish. So I think what happened is there was sort of an acceptance of phonics, and people who had been on the sort of whole language side, it became known more as balanced literacy. And the idea was, well, let's do a little bit of phonics instruction. But they sort of kept the rest of the theory and idea of how to do it intact, which was not a lot of explicit instruction, not too much phonics, a lot of kids sort of teaching themselves, and this idea that justified not having phonics, which was people don't have to sound out the words. That's one way you can read. But you can do all these other things too. And so there was this theory that came through observational research of how people read, and it was oh, you can be a good reader without really being good at sounding out the words. So we don't need to teach kids to do that. We can teach kids to do this, but actually we can teach them all these other things they can do, these other strategies that will help them get to the goal faster, get to meaning faster. So we started giving kids these certain kinds of books, these very predictable books where they could look at the pictures and We gave them long lists of words to memorize. And it was all
Mm-hmm.
sort of a way that we could do just kind of a little sprinkle of phonics and a bunch of this other stuff, and it would all be fine. And it's all fine for some kids, especially kids who have the advantage of it being easy for them, them coming from a background where they're getting a lot of exposure to language anyway, and
Mm-hmm.
having parents who can provide the safety net of teaching them themselves or getting them
Right.
a tutor, right? So that's a group of advantaged kids in various ways. There's not just one way they're advantaged. And then there's a group of kids who are not advantaged in those ways, who are really kind of just really being left behind by a system that is
Right.
holding on to these old theories. So my long speech on phonics is critical. It's important for teachers to understand why phonics is critical. This is not just all about phonics, because if all you do is teach kids how to decode the words, that other big part, the language comprehension part, goes missing.
Mm-hmm.
Kids are not going to become good readers. And this is not about going back to some good old days. And mostly what I tried to focus on in Sold a Story is getting rid of this idea that kids don't have to sound out words, because you can instead teach them all these other ways to read the words. It turns out that what you're doing when you do that is you're teaching kids the habits of struggling readers. So the very things that people who are not very good at reading words do, like guess a lot, skip a lot of words, kind of try to think of a word that makes sense. Look at the first letter of a big long word and then just take a whack at it. And it's not necessarily the word that is on the page.
It was an interesting part of one of your podcasts, maybe it was in part 2, where the parent was talking about watching her kid try to guess the word based on maybe the first letter and then the picture, and just getting it like wrong, completely
Yes.
wrong, not even in the same hemisphere. And that would be terrifying to, like, see your second grader as an example. I think the kid was first or second grade. Just not understand what he or she just had no comprehension of what they're seeing. That one stuck with me. And I also have a young child, so this is really, I think, really pertinent for me. I want to ask you a question here about the podcast specifically. So, can you share with our listeners what were some of the bigger hurdles that you had to overcome as part of your investigation? I'm sure this wasn't received lightly.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I've been doing this reporting for many years now. So Sold a Story was really the culmination of a lot of reporting. It was grounded in a lot of reporting that I'd already done. Certainly, one of the biggest challenges is that there were a lot of people who don't want to talk about this. Right? This is tense stuff within schools, and it still is. And there are a lot of people who are very upset about a lot of this reporting. I think that it's been difficult for many teachers, and I've talked to many teachers who it's been difficult for, but who many of them, it's difficult at first, but then they really have this moment of realizing a few different things. One is, wow, I really didn't know this. And this makes sense as I start to learn about all the science of reading stuff. I knew in my gut, and sometimes more than just in my gut, that wasn't doing enough. I wasn't doing what I didn't know how to teach a lot of kids to read. A bunch of the kids in my class were learning to read anyway, but teachers have said to me, I knew it was maybe kind of in spite of me in some cases, and those kids who were really struggling, they really just didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to help those children. So in terms of the reporting process itself, certainly what was difficult is that there were a lot of people who didn't want to talk to us. There were a lot of really key people that we really felt like we needed and wanted to talk to who wouldn't talk to us. But I think what I was helped by is that since I have been doing this reporting for many years, a lot of people were writing to me. I was starting to see a lot of people on social media. I was seeing the very people who started out sort of upset and angry and defensive about this reporting. And I literally watched some people on Twitter X do a 180 over the course of like 2 years, where they were yelling at me on Twitter, a couple of years ago, and they have really changed their mind. And so I was seeing those transformations. Some of those people were letting me interview them. Many of them were saying, I can't talk to you yet, or I can't talk to you now, and some of them still every once in a while now will reach out to me. I can talk to you now, years later, but they couldn't talk either because of their own situation they were in emotionally, or just because of the situation they were literally in with their school, where they were starting to understand some things that weren't right about the way they were teaching reading. And they just felt like they couldn't speak up or they had spoken up, but they really had been taken to
Hmm.
task by their colleagues or the people above them. I've heard some really scary stories from teachers about the way that they have been just afraid to question and afraid to bring up that there might merely be a problem with instruction, that there's
Mm-hmm.
so it's been sort of like a it's been a problem hiding in plain sight, a sort of elephant in the
Yeah, I
room
was just going to say that, right?
for a long time.
Yeah, I think one of the other things that was really important to me listening to the podcast was, you generally think about young kids. And so, as a librarian and people who are working in literacy, we really kind of hang our hat on that third grade. If you know how to read by third grade, you'll have more success. But something that was really interesting is that you interviewed a grown man
Hmm.
who, and so I was thinking about that when you said fear and with the teachers, but just his ability to be open and honest and raw and say, listen, as a grown man, as an older man at that point, I don't know how to read. We have a young man that we've interviewed here on this show a couple of times. He's probably in his late 20s, and he came out. I'm not sure if you know him. Jessica, if you could throw it in the chat for her. He came out as he couldn't read it, as illiterate, but he owned it. And so he's got this whole experience where Oliver James, that's his name, where he taught himself to read online. He got something like 500,000 followers because there were lots of people who his bravery allowed space to say, listen, I don't know how to do it either. And I'm an adult. So
Yeah.
that was something I wanted to just share. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions, more library focused, because you said libraries aren't doing it either earlier on. And so now I'm curious. So, what do you see as the role of the public library, or even the school library, in this conversation and how we can advance or support literacy?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, I don't know if I have really an answer of what I think the role should be. I have many librarians have reached out to me, and actually, there's a librarian in I think it's the first episode of Sold a Story. I think many parents really need help in resources. Like they really want to know, what can I do if my kid is struggling with reading? And they go to the librarian, and the librarian, I think, gives an answer that you've referred to, which is a perfectly good answer in many ways, which is the librarian's job is to help find books and find books that this kid's going to be interested in, find books that will get this kid reading. But I think in many cases, what's missing there is that the kid can't read and needs something else before they can. Before they're going to get in, before you're going to like hook them with a book, there's more that they need to know about how to do it. And what a few librarians said to me is they've started to learn some about the science of reading stuff, and they realize they don't have the right resources to give to parents. Parents will come in and say, do you have a book that I can take out where I can teach my kid to read? And the librarians will say, don't have that book. They don't, and they realize, like, I want to have answers. I want to have answers to a parent. I want to tell them, here are some books you can try. Here are some places you can go. Here are some places where maybe you can find a tutor. Here are places where maybe you can find a free tutor. That people are coming to their library looking for help with literacy. And in all of our communities, there are many parents and adults who are looking for help with learning how to read. And what librarians have told me is they realize that they're not equipped to help as much as they wish they could on that part of it. They are able to help with, let me find you books that will interest you, all of that. But on the learning how to read part, they have told me they didn't feel equipped. And I have heard from a few that they are doing some sort of training in the science of reading, just like many teachers are. Like maybe the way to hook
That's
people into this in
that's
librarians is
that's exactly right. And Emily, that's why you're here.
great.
I mean, if I could just be really honest with you, we started internally having a conversation about the science of reading and what we could think about and think about doing differently. And then so our team found you. And so this is partially why you're here. One, to bring more awareness to the topic, but because as professionals, we're also curious of how we can help our user or our neighbors. It's interesting. So we do something called visioning sessions. Just really quickly, last fall we did it where we canvassed many people who use the libraries. And basically we ask them, what do you need? What do you need from us? And resoundingly, Emily, parents and teachers and supporters say, we need help with these students. They need tutoring. All of the stuff before, but then compounded by COVID-19 and the pandemic. And so for the very first time this summer, we're launching our Reading Stars program, where we're bringing in actual teachers, credentialed teachers, to do one-on-one reading tutoring for the kids. And we're doing it over the summer, so not to interfere with what's happening at school. But you've just said it. They're coming to us like, help. And we realize that we're just not well equipped for the task. And so that's really the inception of this program. I have like 15 questions in the chat, and I have to get to them because that's the more important part of this. But I end every interview with this question. What are you reading?
What am I reading? Okay, so
obviously no novels.
Well, no, I try. I'm in a book club actually. So I just started reading Demon Copperhead, but a lot of times I can't really get myself absorbed in a novel except when I'm on vacation. So I started reading it at Christmas time, and so sad. I'm like 150 pages in, but then I didn't read it anymore. So that's the novel that I'm trying to read. I have a whole bunch of books like on my floor about all of this reading stuff that I'm reading too. I have a friend who's written this new book. His name is Robert Jones, and he wrote a book called The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy.
Uh-huh.
And he's written a couple of other books about this, the end of white Christian America. And what he studies is sort of the role of the evangelical church and white Protestants, and the history of this country and race and racism. And it's some really fascinating stuff. And this most recent one, which is The Hidden Roots, I'm just reading it here, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy, which I just said, not only looks at a lot of like the data that he's collected over the years on this question, but it really looks back historically and looks at some certain examples of sort of racial reckoning in different parts of the country, and ties it back to this history of white Protestants, and it's good. Those are the two.
I'm adding it to my reading list. Yeah. So let's jump into some of these questions. One question here is, do you have this in Spanish? So we will have the ability to translate it, I believe, when it's turned on to YouTube, when we put it on YouTube. Let's see. Where are the questions?
One thing about,
here?
while you're looking,
Yep.
can I say one thing about the Spanish version too?
Uh-huh.
So I think people were asking if this is going to be available in Spanish, but I mentioned before that Sold a Story is going to be available in Spanish.
That's right, you did.
So we condensed it down to a 1-hour version. So we basically took the whole podcast and did it in a 1-hour version, and it's in Spanish. And then we did a second episode, which is specifically about particular questions that parents of kids who speak Spanish at home and are learning to read English at school, the questions they might have, the problems they might be encountering, what they do if their kids are struggling. And we've created a whole web page with resources in Spanish. So we have a list of places people can go for resources about like how to figure out if your kid might have dyslexia, how to find a tutor, how to understand the basics of how people learn how to read. We've put all of that together, all of that's in Spanish. And then we've translated a few of the other articles that we've written over the years into Spanish too. So I really hope that people who know parents who primarily communicate in Spanish and have kids in schools in the United States will share this with these resources with them.
Excellent. And that's forthcoming.
That's forthcoming in the next couple of weeks. We don't have a date, but it should be out. Be out before the middle of March.
So here's a great question. We get this one all the time. What are your thoughts on graphic novels like Dog Man books or The Babysitter Club? What are your thoughts on that?
I'll tell you thoughts that I've heard from other people. I don't know if I have any of my own original thoughts. I mean, certainly what I don't think I'm not like against graphic novels in any way. One of my kids was really into graphic novels, like lots of great graphic novels. So there's nothing wrong with them. I do think that graphic novels often get suggested to kids who really have trouble with reading. And it's really important to recognize that this kid has trouble with reading, and giving them lots of graphic novels is fine, but you need to address, why is this kid having such a hard time with the words? It's very important for this kid to get good at reading the words. So that is, I think, sometimes a sign that something else needs to be done. So there's nothing wrong with graphic novels, but if it is being given to a kid because they really can't deal with the words, they don't like the words, then they need help with how to read those words.
That's right. I'm inclined to agree with that. Here's a good one for you. How is it that places like Germany, Iceland, and a lot of European countries don't have literacy issues? What are they doing right? Or maybe what she's saying, what are we doing wrong? And I don't know that that's exactly right.
Well, so I haven't done in-depth reporting in these other countries. First of all, there are literacy issues in other countries for sure. But I do think that this is a big problem in the English-speaking world. I think it partly has to do with the fact that English is a difficult language to learn how to read. So it is not only difficult for the children, but it requires more knowledge of the teachers. And overall, we're not doing a good enough job training our teachers, just overall. And I think especially into how to teach reading. So I think we've got this double whammy of a language that's hard to learn, a language that requires, I don't know that a lot of teachers go into teaching, say, first grade, thinking they really have to understand in depth English spelling and how it works. But in fact, they probably do. Because, there's a lot at the level of just understanding reading and how it works and understanding the English language. Two really difficult things that I think we really need to up the skills of our teachers with. So I think that's part of it. Obviously, education systems vary in country to country for a lot of different reasons. We have a very decentralized system in the United States, and I don't know that there's good evidence that centralized or not centralized leads to better outcomes, but we have a hard time making change at scale in this country because we have so much like local control. And I think some other countries have been able to make bigger change at scale. I think England is one of those countries, for example, an English-speaking country that has made some strides with this reading stuff, but also hasn't figured out the whole equation. They've done some really good things to be better at teaching the foundational skills when kids are young, but they're not seeing as many gains as they would like in the reading comprehension later. So there's a lot of parts to this puzzle that we have to be paying attention to here. It's not just about getting the early foundational skills part right.
Yeah, thank you for that.
One other thing I'll say about that, which I find really fascinating, is a lot of people have talked about Finland and how great Finland is. And this is a very complex question, and I don't know that this is the answer, but I'll tell you, I mean, and if you've ever looked at Finnish, it's all these big, long words. But apparently it's a very, very easy language to learn how to read. So it's very, very transparent orthographically. And so I just think that so a lot of people say, well, they're in Finland, they don't even start teaching kids to read until they're 7 or 8 years old. I may be misspeaking. But that's because it doesn't take very long to teach kids how to read.
Right.
One of the reasons why it's a good idea for us to really start teaching kids in kindergarten and really be expecting a lot of reading development in first grade is because if you're going to get good at reading by third grade, you've got to start in kindergarten. You're not going to get good at it without a few 2 or 3 years of some good instruction.
That's right. I agree with that. Here's an interesting question. She's saying she would like to know what the future of reading looks like. Many young people say that reading as well as writing by hand are becoming outdated skills, and they've decided not to learn. In California, they're making cursive mandatory again, but that's another conversation. They say that Chat GPT will help them and learn to type is more worthwhile. What are your thoughts about a comment like that?
Well, there's a lot there. There's a lot of questions there.
I tried to truncate it. I'm editing live.
There is some very important and interesting research that writing is very, very important, and learning how to physically, like writing really matters. Writing and reading are sort of the reciprocals of each other, right? You really need to learn to you need to learn both, and you learn from learning both of those things. I think there's a lot of things to explore about the way that reading is changing. There's a woman named Marianne Wolf who's written some really interesting stuff about what's happening to our brains in the digital age, and the whole idea of deep reading, which we were talking about before in terms of getting absorbed in novels. The Chat GPT thing, I'll tell you, I mean, I can't predict all of that, but I'll tell you one of the things we really do know about tools like that is they're as good as the information that you put into them. Right?
100%.
And if you don't have good information to put in, I've played around with ChatGPT, and if you put in some good information and good, it can help you. It can help you organize things. It is actually scarily good at writing. It is a little bit freaky, but I'm sure you often feel this way too. I feel very much like, oh, I worry about the younger generation because these tools are very, very helpful when you have a lot of skills already.
When
But
you
if
have
you're
a basis,
when you have a
yes.
baseline, but when you're expecting them to do it for you, it's changing something very dramatic. I mean, learning how to read and write is also learning how to think. If you and I still think through writing. That's one of the things, I'm a writer, and you think you have a thought and then you try to write it down and you realize, do I really have a thought? And you have to really like work at the writing to figure out what the thought is. And these things, your thought is made crisper by the writing and your writing is made crisper by the thought. And this is an iterative process that you can't just turn to ChatGPT to do because then it never went through your brain.
No, you're absolutely right. There was a great quote recently I saw by Noam Chomsky, one of my favorite writers. And it says, artificial intelligence is not intelligence at all. It's really just the highest level of plagiarism. You can chomp on that one a little bit because it's not necessarily teaching you how to think more broadly or more comprehensively. Though I think your point is well taken that if you have a baseline understanding of a subject or a skill, and then you use Chat GPT to kind of expand your thought process, that I think that's the difference. That's a dividing line for me. I could sit here and talk to you all night long, but now it's 10 o'clock on the East Coast, and I'm sure it is your bedtime. I want to thank you so much for joining us. I've found this to be a fascinating conversation. Maybe we can bring you back for a part 2 in a year once you do a little more research and have maybe the Spanish version of the podcast available to our listeners.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It was really fun.
Yes. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. We will see you very soon for our next Trailblazer. Again, thank you to Emily and have a great night.
Have a good night, everyone. Thanks.